How successful is your AI pair programming? Maybe you're using Claude Code or Cursor or Root Code, and you put in best practices like a requirements document, a PRD, and a task list, and you're having some success. You're loving the AI pair programming, but you notice after a while that just some things don't work out the way you want, and you wonder, could you review all the past work that the AI has done and come up with a better plan for the future? In this video, we're looking at retrospectives, and we're going to see if we can implement an AI retrospective. I'm Happy Dave, let's get into it. So in traditional software development, there is a particular methodology known as Agile, and within that there is a framework known as Scrum, in which there's this ability for people to work for what's called a sprint, a 2-week period as an example, to build a section of the software application as a team. And at the end of the sprint, there might be something going on called a retrospective, where they look back through what worked, what didn't work, and see if they can improve things for the next sprint in the software development cycle. So if your developers are writing code and you notice inefficiency and you talk about it in the retrospective, should the same idea be applied to the AI pair programmers that we're now using? Now, I've just gone and implemented a whole lot of functionality using Claude Code, and everything ran on autopilot. I was pretty happy with the output, but I thought there was a little bit of inefficiency that I want to improve the next time I write a section of code for this application. So let's have a quick look at the application that I'm talking about. And this is a minimum viable product, an MVP, that I've been putting together in the form of a wizard. And it's got little capabilities like a button up here that will preload with some data so that when I'm testing the application, I don't have to fill it in. When I press next, we go to a new page, and I'll press next again, which is actually under my picture at the moment. And you'll see that it's starting to load data from an external source. And the idea of that external source is that it would be an N8N workflow, but that's something that I can swap between by being on mock. At the moment it's fake data. When I click this button, it becomes live data, which would be the N8N workflow. And all these capabilities that you're seeing were all done over a series of individual steps that were well documented, and the AI pair programmer wrote all the code itself. So let's step back to the AI retrospective and how I was putting this particular application together using a concept called the BMAD method. And what the BMAD method is based off this video series that I saw called BMAD Code, and there's a GitHub repo related to it. You can see here it's an AI-powered Agile development framework, which will take your requirements document and break it up into concepts known as epics. And when we look at our requirements document here, we can see that I went through a bunch of epics, and each of them will have a list of stories to be executed. And you just feed these stories one at a time into an AI pair programmer, and it starts writing the code for you. So when we look at the technology stack, which was Epic 1, there were a bunch of stories, and that gave this application the ability to work with React, ShadCN, Tailwind CSS, Vite, different technologies like that. When I got to Epic 2, we got the application shell, which is all the stuff that we're seeing with the menus on the left. We've got little quick search concepts that we can pop up. They're not yet styled. We've got a little light and dark mode. Again, there's some styling issues going on. But then I moved on to the main styling, which is what I needed for the main wizard. And we're seeing that wizard here. Now, as I was developing it, it's essentially a human in the loop agent wizard, backed by N8N workflows. So when I started this feature known as an epic, I had 7 different stories, and the first story was this first page that you're seeing right here. And then as soon as you loaded in data, you could move on to the next page, which would be the second story. And so since there were 6 different wizard pages plus a final page, we had 7 stories. But by the time I got to the end of writing all the code, once I thought of things like the modal dialogue, talking to N8N, talking to mock data, we ended up with 13 different stories going on. And I had to shift things around a little bit during the conversational process. Now, I will point out that the experience of writing code with BMAD and Claude Code and just following through on these stories allowed me to create all these commits, and each individual commit was done almost in a one-shot prompt in which Claude would just go through and work through the different items. At the end of it, I'd put in a little bit of information to say, please create this fancy commit message that you're seeing, commit it to the repository, push it all the way up. And sometimes I'd forget, so this one I forgot to do 4.6, so 4.6 and 4.7 went up together, and this happened a couple of times. But essentially it was writing code, it was writing documentation like you're seeing right here, and all of it without me actually having to write any code. Now, before we do the retrospective, if you're actually interested in seeing how I'm building a human-in-the-loop, agent-based AI workflow application, and it's all done using the BMAD method and Claude Code, then check out the video down below. But for now, let's have a look at what this document is that it created. So at the moment, we're looking at Epic 4, which is a list of all the stories that it went through as it was developing the software. Now, the stories are not the actual stories that Claude Code worked with. What these are summaries that are expanded just before it's about to write the code. So whenever my AI pair programmer, Claude Code in this case, was going to work on a particular story, it would go and create a new story in the stories folder, and it'd be the same information, just way more expanded. We've got a lot of extra information, including a section right at the beginning called definition of done. And this would be a checked off list of the things that were done in that story. So now we have a complete record of what we created, what was done, and we've got that repeated for every story. So knowing that, let's have a look through the retrospective analysis prompt. And we've got this idea that you're conducting a retrospective analysis on Epic 4, the guided incident capture workflow, and that there are objectives. We've got process improvements, requirements analysis, technical insights, and a look at the BMAD method. Now it's looking at how it can do that, so it can use data gathering through the Git-based analysis, the documentation analysis, which is just looking at all those documents we just mentioned, including the Claude doc. It can also go and look through all the commit messages, and it can go through the code base analysis by starting from the initial commit for the Epic and going through and looking at the last one. So it's got different areas that it's going to analyze for us, with the idea of building up a summary, what went well and what we can improve in the future. So when we look at the specific insights, there's a lot of them going on, but I think the best thing is we'll just head down to a terminal, and I often run a little alias called Claude Sonnet to run it with the Sonnet model, but for this we'll go straight into Claude, which should default to the Opus model. And I'm also going to press Shift Tab because I want to go into planning mode to do this. And I'm going to say, can you run a retrospective? And with that, we'll put in the @sign, type in retrospective, and it should find the file we want. It's right there, and we'll press enter. At this point, it's starting to run. We'll just bring up the terminal a little bit, and it should come up with a little plan of action before it starts executing. It's looking at gathering information using the Git log. It's wanting to read all the stories starting with the number 4. So here's the plan of action. It's analyzed 13 different commits. We got 82 file changes. We got 13 stories. Review all 13 stories, 4.1 through 4.13. Now, one of the things that I'm a little confused about is that when we look at this area, we've got 4.7 all the way through to 4.13, and maybe we don't have enough. So what I'm going to do is just say no and say the stories you picked start at 4.7 and go through to 4.13, but you have not gone through 4.1 to 4.6. So maybe it has done that because part of the plan mentioned it, but it never mentioned it in the details. So I'd like to just be a little bit more complete before we move on. So now it's reading that particular file. And that was what I was noticing as it was reading individual files, that these early stories weren't being read into memory. And that's interesting. It's going to loop through a bunch of those files. I think it's combining them all into one output. We can see the commits being read right here, and it's reporting that it has a complete plan with everything from 4.1 to 4.13. We've got all them listed. We've got the description of what they all do. So this is a plan of action of what it's going to do: create an Epic 4 retrospective document structure, which is great. It's a retrospective, so it's not going to alter the original Epic. We're going to have an executive summary, what went well, what could have been improved, key insights, and actionable recommendations. So it's created the document. Let's go have a look at this in VS Code. Out to say the Epic 4 retrospective guided incident capture workflow. That's what we were working on. We've got an executive summary that states that Epic 4 was delivered. It was done using 13 stories, and it was done over 6 days. And that's about right. So I was spending about 40 minutes to 60 minutes each day just working on this. So essentially about 2 to 3 stories a day in an hour each. It took 6 days. We've got this story's completed 13, and it says that the original was 11. That's not actually correct. It was only about 7. So I know there's something going on here, but the rest of this document, which I've had a bit of a look through, is pretty useful to me. Now, from your point of view, if you're doing a retrospective, what you're going to read here is useful, but it will be totally different from your situation. The main goal that we're trying to achieve here is understand where we can make improvements to the AI workflows in the future. So let's just have a quick look at some other areas in here. So in June 17, 18, and 19, which is when the original part of the wizard was in place, capturing of data across 6 pages and showing a final clarification. And what I hadn't thought of through properly was test data, enhancing it, using an API, using a mock so I could go between mock data and also go through the N18 workflow, and then just doing some UX improvements is all the extra stories that got added on. Now, where it went well is that in Epic 2, which is where I designed how the wizard could work without any implementation of pages, and it was able to use that framework quite successfully to build the 7 wizard steps. When it was doing the first clarification, and this was essentially going off to the server to rework some of the data that was input using a large language model, was using this ugly little spinner, and I turned it into a clarification step. There was also a modal dialogue. That refactor proved to be really useful across multiple pages. I think this statement here is also really useful and shows why the BMAD method was really good. So it would have these acceptance criteria, it would have the definition of done that would get checked off. And so I never saw it going off and doing stuff that I never asked it to do. And this is really powerful, the adaptive development, because there were a bunch of things that I forgot, and I'll show you the screen. So popping over to the wizard, these forms were all in scope, but this little button here to provide test data wasn't. So when I press that button, we get new test data. Now, as I move through, we got test data filled in, and I'll go one more step where it's working with mock data, and then you'll notice there's no test data here, but I was able to add a second state to this so that when I click it one more time, it fills in additional test data, because the idea of this is an MVP. I don't need it to have it work against N18. I can go from the mock view, which is using a little JSON structure behind the scenes, to actually talking to an N18 server. And it's those little concepts that this adaptive development are talking about, adding the API toggle. This sort of stuff was not thought of, and it was easy to add in. Another thing that was really useful in this is I was using this Zusten to store the designs, the shape of the data, and this worked really well. So I never specified the names of the fields in the API at all, and that ran into a problem, and it's actually identified that by the changes I had to make mid-epic. So worked out some of the things that I hadn't fully worked through with the UX. It's then mentioned the size of the stories, and it's got this idea of combined data type coupling. I'm not sure that anything really could have been improved here, so some of this is informational and not to be acted on. And now it's starting to point out information in the code base. This is pretty good actually. The API service layer is mixing concerns. So we've got configurations, an if statement as to whether it should be mock or live. I assume we've got a little bit of code that's inside as an if statement. So this is at least telling us information in the future that we can improve our code base on. It's mentioned the missing abstractions, especially this repeated clarification UI logic. Essentially at one stage in the development, it was repeating the code on each of the wizard pages. And it's also highlighting something that I haven't done and it wasn't part of the MVP, and that's unit tests. So this one line here, the API contract importance, makes it really useful if we are doing another epic, and I will be moving on to epic 5, which is a different wizard, and it will have its own contracts. So I now have some guidance from this document which I could apply to the epic 5 document to say, is there anything that we learnt here that could improve the current epic? So all of this just keeps going on. I read it, I thought some of it I dismissed, some of it I thought was accurate. There were the odd hallucinations going on. It was really good that it worked out a state management pattern using Zustan, because that was not thought of at the beginning of this. I personally am not a JavaScript developer, so I don't come from the background of knowing exactly what I need to implement. I wanted to do a retrospective to point out what I don't currently know in this sort of code flow. We've got this new handle next enhancement pattern that's going to be useful in the next wizard that we put in place. And here we can see this if statement around whether it should use the mock data or should use the real data. Maybe this is an area that I could guide it by using the inversion of control pattern rather than this if statement, but I think the code's pretty small and easy to read at the moment. And so at this point it starts going on to an analysis of the BMAD method. Now, the other thing to note, this is the first time I've used BMAD. I was learning myself, and in the meantime, they've moved from version 3 to version 4 yesterday. So the next time I do a video, I'm going to go through this method again, and I'll understand it a lot more. But when I look at the weaknesses that are listed here, I don't see anything in this list that I actually had to worry about. So I'm not looking at any weaknesses so far the way this has happened. Now, I found the planning of these first 6 stories, it was excellent. It was great. This idea that I had to be reactive and change things around, and sometimes that meant inserting stories ahead of others and having to renumber, that was a little bit of a challenge. And then we get this estimation accuracy, and this is where things are a little bit out of whack. These numbers in these 2 cells are not quite correct because I don't believe they were there originally anyway. Now this next section, which is all about the documentation created by the BMAD method, is actually really useful. So when the epic planning is being done, an improvement is to have the developer experience stories built in. So what happens with test data, development tool workflows, debugging utilities, so that could be logging, stuff like that. And is there any local development setup requirements? So some of the things that I think I was changing along the way was also ensuring that it was using a linter correctly. And this area I really wasn't working on, so I didn't have a flow chart for the user story. There was no sequence diagram for the API. There was no state management data flows. So this is useful information that could go into future planning. And understanding the JSON data contract for both the data going to the endpoints and how it comes back is also going to be really useful. Now this area around having patterns documented is also something I've been thinking about from having another repository that I merge into any code that I'm doing that has my ideas around single responsibility principle, design patterns, and just basic patterns of code ready to go with. So it's suggested that we do it within this application right now. though it's the sort of thing that you probably want to keep doing if you're doing many applications. Now, as we look at the process refinements, I want to also point out that if you're using a tool that can have multiple agents, what you can do is maybe have something like the architecture review, or you might have something to generate unit tests being done as a sub-agent. So not part of the normal flow, but something that happens asynchronously. So some of this information that we're seeing is probably too much for me to want to take on board in the next epic. But as this continuous improvement happens, I can start thinking of them. Does it go into the next epic, or does it come in from a different point of view? Such as every time you complete a story, do you run a separate task just around the unit tests? Or every time you do 3 stories, such as they say here, do you do architecture review check-in? And this is really interesting. So we could probably run this and get these extractable reusable patterns put into the code base for us both here. And we could also ask it to go on and build these documents within the architecture directory. So here we're getting an idea of the lines changed in each of the stories, but it's this next one that I really love. So before the epic, this is what it looked like, a wizard routes, and after the epic, this is all the new stuff that's been added. Now, the lessons learned, which is the whole reason for doing a retrospective. Now, keep in mind that this is done around a framework that I'm using called BMAD, but you might be using something else. You might be just creating requirements documents. You might have a PRD, product requirements documents. You might have Taskmaster and building out task lists. The reason I'm using BMAD is it kind of rolls all of those concepts up together. And it's pointed out here that it probably should be adapted to have developer experience tools. And for me, this was the automatic test or seed data being populated when I needed it to happen. There's also the extracting patterns, which is taking that code that's been repeated, putting it into a patterns directory. And this would be an end of epic capability that I'd want to do every time I'm working through the code base. So that was an AI retrospective, just to check how the progression of a successful code implementation could be improved and what measures you want to take in the future. Now, if you're interested in working one-on-one with me, you can book a call, come to the website, click on that button and book a session. Otherwise, if you're just interested in learning more about coding with Claude Code, using the BMAD method, or building an application a day, which is my goal, then like and subscribe on the channel. I'm Happy Dave. I'll see you in the next video.